The moment you become irreplaceable on the wrong rung, the ladder stops being a ladder. It becomes a welding station. That is the first truth. Most people think being great at their job is the strategy. Show up early, hit deadlines, solve the ugly problems, become dependable, earn trust, make yourself useful. They think if they do that long enough, the organization will naturally lift them upward. In some rare places, maybe in most places, no, in most places, every problem you solve on your current rung becomes another weld holding you there. And the cruel part is that the weld feels like praise while it is happening. Your manager trusts you more, your teammates depend on you more, you get the hardest accounts, you fix the broken process, you train the new hire. You handle the angry client, you own the monthly report nobody else understands, you become critical. People say that word like it is a compliment. Sometimes it is. Often it is a warning, because when you become too valuable on your current rung, the ladder above you stops moving for a very simple reason. Promoting you creates pain for the person who has to live with the hole you leave behind. That is the replacement tax, and most managers would rather pay you just enough praise to keep you steady than pay the operational pain of replacing you. That is not always cruelty. That is incentives. I trust incentives more than speeches. If promoting you creates risk, gap, retraining cost, delivery risk, and political exposure for the manager right now, while keeping you where you are preserves stability right now, then we value you so much can become the exact reason you stay stuck. That is what almost nobody tells young professionals. They tell you competence wins. Competence matters. But competence alone is not a strategy. Competence gets you welded to a rung unless you understand the rest of the game. The source you gave me says this very clearly in its own way. You get good at your job, solve problems quietly, become the reliable person, and then discover that your value is being interpreted in a very specific way. You are not being seen as someone to move. You are being seen as someone who is expensive to move, because the replacement process creates risk and work for the people above you. That is the core mechanism, and it is real. Fay file site fay turn 45 file 0 fay. Once you understand that, a lot of career confusion becomes less mysterious. You stop asking, why am I doing everything right and still not moving? You start asking, am I being rewarded for growth, or am I being rewarded for staying useful where I already am? Those are radically different situations, and if you cannot tell the difference, you can lose years inside a role that keeps getting heavier without getting higher. That is how the ladder becomes a weld. The first stage of the weld is usefulness. Most people think usefulness is neutral. It is not. Usefulness is directional. Useful for what? Useful to whom? Useful for the next level, or useful to keep the current level functioning? Those are not the same thing. If you are useful because you can execute reliably, solve recurring problems, keep operations clean, rescue deadlines, and reduce your manager's stress, then you are building execution value. Fine, that has worth. But execution value often makes you more sticky on your current rung, not more portable to the next one. That is because organizations do not promote people based only on what they have done. They promote based on the risk of what happens next. And the risk of removing a quietly competent person from a role everybody leans on is often judged as higher than the reward of moving that person upward. The source gives the exact examples that matter. You become the one who fixes the system when it breaks, the one who handles the messy accounts, the one who trains the new hire, the one who absorbs the work nobody else wants. Then suddenly your current job quietly becomes two jobs, but none of the expansion is called promotion. That is not a random accident. That is what organizations do when they discover someone who reduces friction without creating political noise. Fay felicite fay turn 45 file 0 fay. That is the reliability prison. I call it that because it feels safe from the inside. People thank you. You become trusted. You become the go-to person. That phrase sounds like status often. It is just a prettier way to say the system has decided where to pin you. Now let us talk about why this gets worse over time. Repetition. This is where the trap becomes psychological instead of merely structural. When you get very good at a job, you start working faster. You know the shortcuts, the systems, how to route around confusion. You can do in 2 hours what used to take 6. That feels like mastery, sometimes it is. But there is a hidden danger inside that kind of efficiency. Efficiency can become repetition in a tuxedo. The source says this directly. When you are very good at the current job, you stop learning in the way you think you are learning. You are optimizing, you are becoming faster at the same things. The organization rewards the speed and the reliability, but the skills one level up are often completely different. Strategy, delegation, ambiguity management, cross-functional influence, judgment under uncertainty. Yet your day keeps paying you to get better at delivery. Not range, fay turn. 45 file 0 fay. This is where smart people quietly ruin themselves. They confuse stronger execution with broader readiness. It is a fatal confusion. Because the next rung is not usually a bigger version of the current rung, it is a different game, but if you spend all your time becoming brilliant at the current game, you create a beautiful record for the wrong job. That is one of the most expensive mistakes in modern careers. A year later, you are faster. 2 years later, you are indispensable. 3 years later, you are deeply associated with one system. 4 years later, you are the expert on a narrow domain. 5 years later, you wake up and realize something awful. You are incredible at the job you no longer want. That is not progress. That is specialization without ascent. The source is brutally honest about this too. Performance reviews keep praising reliability, delivery, process mastery, but they are not necessarily evaluating readiness for the next role, because that is not what your current role is demanding from you every day. And when the next opening appears, the people making the decision are not looking for the person best at the old job. They are looking for the person they can tell a believable story about in the new one. Fay turn 45 file 0 fay, that is the story gap. And the story gap destroys careers quietly. Most people think reviews are about data. They are not, at least not in the way that matters for movement. Data can prove you are solid. Narrative is what makes you promotable. The people 2 levels up are not staring at your task list. They are asking a much sloppier and much more dangerous question. When I picture the next role, who comes to mind? That is not a spreadsheet question. That is a story question. The source describes this exactly. Promotion decisions do not really happen in your performance review. They happen in succession conversations, skip-level discussions, hallway talk, and the informal narrative exchanges where senior people decide who feels ready. And readiness there is often not about your actual output volume. It is about whether someone can tell a convincing story that you already operate, like the next rung. Fay turn 45 file 0 fay. That is why being the best executor on the floor below does not automatically move you up. In fact, it can do the opposite. Because now people have a strong story about you already. You are the Excel person, the operations person, the escalation person, the person who fixes the mess, the person who knows the old system, the person everybody calls when something breaks. At first, that feels like recognition. Then it hardens into identity. Then identity hardens into limitation. That is the label lock. The source says it plainly. Organizations label people quickly, not formally. But in the way they talk about them in rooms they are not in. And once the label sticks, it becomes easier for people to imagine you continuing to do that thing than to imagine you doing something broader. Fay turn 45, file 0 fay. This is one of the cruelest career truths because it makes diligence double-edged. The harder you prove one thing, the more the organization uses that proof as evidence against your range. It should not work that way. Often it does. That is why the next part matters so much. Silence. A lot of competent people are professionally silent because they think results should speak. That sounds noble. It is also strategically weak in many organizations. The source makes this point sharply. Silence gets misread as satisfaction. If you never state what you want, leadership assumes you are fine where you are. If you do not create urgency around your trajectory, the default assumption is that your current usefulness is the main thing worth preserving. Fay turn 45 file 0 fay. That is not because everyone is stupid. It is because organizations are busy. They respond to what is in front of them. And if your goals are not in front of them, the organization reverts to the most convenient story, which is usually keep the reliable person where the reliable person is. This is where many workers make a moral mistake. They think speaking about ambition feels political or needy or self-promotional. Maybe it does. I do not care. The alternative is usually much more expensive. The alternative is becoming so low maintenance that you disappear as a growth priority. Low maintenance is wonderful in a hotel. It is terrible as a career identity. The source says this without dressing it up. The people who move are often not the absolute best at the current job. They are the people who make their work visible, build relationships outside the immediate team, and make clear that they are growing with or without the current role. That does not mean drama, it means clarity. It means the organization must process you as a moving piece, not a fixed utility. Fay file site, Fay turn 45, file 0 Fay. That is how you start weakening the weld. Visibility is the next tool. Now be careful here, because weak people hear visibility and think bragging. That is not what I mean. Visibility is context. If your manager does not know what you are solving, which problems change because of your judgment, which cross-functional outcomes you influenced, and how your work maps to larger business risk or leverage, then your competence remains local. Local competence rarely produces broad narrative lift. The source is exactly right that your manager sees the work, but the people 2 levels up often do not. Those are the people who matter most when the question becomes, who is ready for something larger? Fay Filicite Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. This is why passive excellence is such a dangerous drug. It feels pure. It is rarely well distributed. You can be a hero in a small circle and invisible in the only rooms that count. That is not a moral failure. It is a routing failure. Your value is not traveling upward in a usable form. So fix the route, write the summary, present the pattern, build the cross, functional tie, own the narrative of the work, not just the work itself. Again, this is not vanity. It is translation. A person who cannot translate his value beyond his immediate task box gets buried under his own local competence. And once buried, he starts thinking the organization is irrational. Sometimes it is. Very often it is merely following the wrong incentives combined with incomplete visibility. Now let us go to the hardest part. You may need to become temporarily worse at your current job in order to become qualified for the next one. Most people hate that sentence. Good, they should, because it offends a deep working class instinct that says excellence must always mean doing the current job better and faster. But the source says this directly in its own language. Staying excellent at something that is not growing you becomes a slower way to get stuck. At some point, you have to reallocate effort from perfect execution of the old role toward acquiring some of the next role skills, strategy, delegation, broader communication, ambiguity handling, cross-team influence. That may mean you are slightly less spotless in the old task domain because you are no longer pouring 100% of your intelligence into polishing the wrong rung Fay file site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. This is terrifying for high performers because they built their identity around being the dependable one, the clean one, the no drama one, the person who always nails it. Find that identity may also be the glue. If you are not willing to redirect some of your effort toward next level capability, you will remain a luxury version of the same employee, admired and trapped. That is why I call it welded comfort. Comfort is real. Recognition is real. The little bursts of pride are real, but comfort and progress are not the same thing. The source lands on this beautifully. People think they are building a career when sometimes they are simply building a very comfortable place to stay still. That sentence is worth respecting because comfortable stillness is one of the most socially accepted forms of career decay. Nobody stages an intervention for it. Everyone thinks you are doing fine. The salary still comes. The praise still comes. The routine is stable. Meanwhile, the years start stacking up around a role whose exit value declines because your range did not widen with time. Fay file site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay, that is the long trap. Not failure, misapplied success. And misapplied success is one of the hardest things to diagnose because it does not feel like a mistake while it is happening. That is why external movement becomes so important. The source is right that many people leave companies not because the company is uniquely evil, but because the company has already decided who they are. That is one of the coldest truths in organizational life. Once a story about you hardens internally, it may take more energy to rewrite that story than to walk into a new building where no one has yet mistaken your current rung for your permanent ceiling. Fay file site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay. This is not job hopping evangelism. It is identity economics. Sometimes staying means fighting an old story that now works against you. Sometimes leaving means getting repriced and reimagined at once. That is powerful because a new organization does not begin with your welds. It begins with possibility, and possibility has value. Now, I want to say something difficult to all the quietly competent people listening. You are probably not under-recognized. You are under-positioned. That distinction matters. Under-recognized sounds like a moral tragedy, waiting for a kind leader to fix it. Under-positioned means the burden shifts back to you. What story have you made available? What next-level behaviors are visible? What relationships exist outside your immediate manager? What urgency have you created around your movement? What risks are you willing to impose on the organization if it keeps treating you like a fixture instead of a growing asset? That is the right level of discomfort. Because without discomfort, the weld holds. And the weld is held in place not just by management incentives, but by your own emotional attachment to being admired where you already are. That is the hardest part of the trap. You like being excellent. You like being needed. You like being the one who knows. You like the confidence of familiar systems. You like the low embarrassment of doing work you can dominate. All of that is understandable. All of that can become a cage. This is why competence is only the baseline. The source says that line explicitly, and it may be the most important sentence in the whole transcript. Competence is not the strategy, it is the starting point. After competence, the real strategy begins. Visibility, narrative range, external relationships, stated ambition, reallocation toward next. Level skills, willingness to create a clock, willingness to leave if the organization keeps mistaking your utility for your destiny. Fay file site Fay turn 45 file 0 Fay, that is the escape plan. Not just work hard. That advice is too weak for the machine you are in. Work hard is what got you welded. Now you need a different instruction set. Let me make it even simpler. Do not just become harder to replace, become easier to imagine elsewhere. That is a much better career rule. If your whole professional identity is built around one team, one system, one manager, one report, one account type, one operational niche, then your bargaining power is weak, no matter how loved you are locally. If your identity is built around transferable strategic value, visible pattern recognition, broader relationships, and evidence that you can operate at the next level, then even the same company must process you differently. That is how the ladder becomes a ladder again. Now, let me give you the most useful practical interpretation of everything we just covered. First, keep doing good work, but stop confusing perfect execution with upward motion. Second, decide explicitly what the next rung actually requires and start building evidence for that, not just stronger evidence for the current one. Third, make your ambition visible in plain language, not as whining, not as threat, as direction. Fourth, build story paths beyond your manager. If the only person who knows your value is the person who benefits from keeping you where you are, your career has a structural problem. Fifth, reduce your emotional addiction to being the hero of the current role. Sixth, if the story is too hard to rewrite internally, do not romanticize loyalty. Movement is often cheaper than persuasion. Seventh, remember that the organization may be behaving rationally from its side even while your stagnation becomes irrational from yours. That is a very adult way to see it. The goal is not to hate the manager. The goal is to stop donating years to a system that values your current output more than your future expansion. So here's the final truth. Being excellent at your job can absolutely become the thing that keeps you in it. Not because excellence is bad, because excellence without narrative, range, and movement pressure turns into weld. The praise is real, the trust is real, the dependence is real, the trap is real too. And if you do not learn to tell the difference, then one day you will wake up and realize you did not fail. You succeeded beautifully at the wrong level for far too long. That is a very expensive kind of success. And it is exactly the kind the wage cage hopes you keep calling a career. And let me give you one more distinction that most workers never learn until the damage is already done. There is a difference between being respected and being repositioned. Respect feels good. Repositioning changes your life. A company can respect you for years while keeping you exactly where your usefulness is cheapest to harvest. A manager can trust you deeply while still never pushing hard enough to move you because your competence is making his own current world easier. Teammates can praise you constantly while your career quietly hardens into local importance with no real altitude gain. That is why emotional rewards are so dangerous inside organizations. They can make a person feel valued while his trajectory is actually being flattened. Do not confuse warmth with lift. Do not confuse reliance with growth. Do not confuse being the person everyone needs today with becoming the person the organization must imagine differently tomorrow. Those are not the same thing. And once you see the difference, you stop treating comfort as evidence that the ladder is working. Sometimes comfort is just the weld cooling around your feet.